All right. Can you hear me? Son? I'm going to do the briefest of introductions to these two men. They're well known and they're amazing. First of all, we have David Gates. David Gates's novel Jernigan was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. He wrote the novel Preston Falls. He has two story collections, The Wonders of the Invisible World and A Hand Reached Down to Guide Me. His short stories have appeared in The New Yorker, Tin House, Rolling Stone, the Paris Review, GQ, and Esquire, among other magazines. He was a senior writer and editor of the art section at Newsweek. I almost feel embarrassed to even, I won't even attempt to really introduce Gary Fiskett-John. I've heard his name since I began writing years ago, and he is amazing inspiration. And, you know, some of, like I said earlier, some of the books that we have now I said we are honored to have all of our guests, but I wish to give special acknowledgement to Gary Fiskett-John, who joins us today. Gary Fiskett-John has guided and nurtured the voices of our time. He is singular in his ability to coach, coax, and clarify the manuscripts that have become the greatest books of our generation. You have been influenced by him through books by Cormac McCarthy, Richard Ford, Donna Tartt, Haruki Murakami, William Kittredge, Thomas McGuane, and so much more. So please welcome these two gentlemen for a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
That's the hard part.
That's the hard part. Now comes the wonderful part.
Yeah. Anything's possible.
I know. I think we might be the only ones here without MFAs, is that?
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
but look where we ended up.
like our friend Jenny, I mean, I did you one worse. I was philosophy, history, and literature. Totally unemployable.
I was thinking, listening to those stories, that there's such an element of chance and inadvertence in terms of where people end up and what they end up doing. I know that in 1979 I was a dropout from a PhD program, and I had a choice of taking a job either moving furniture or answering hate mail at Newsweek magazine. So I chose to answer the hate mail, and it's all been hateful ever since. Gary's already skipping out.
Yeah.
What I was going to ask you to tell Gary is, you know, how on earth you got from a mink ranch in Oregon, that luxurious office of yours high above New York City.
Well, by fits and starts, early 70s, it was a good time to be in San Francisco, so I went to college for a couple of years there, helped run some of the last hippies out. And some of my good teachers at this Jesuit college said, look, if you want to spend the rest of your life in San Francisco, a degree from USF is not a bad thing. But if you actually want to get an education, you need to go somewhere else. So I said, like where? I thought West Point was an Ivy League school. I mean, I didn't know anything. I grew up in a mink ranch in Oregon.
You thought it was in the West, probably.
Say what?
You probably thought it was in the West.
Yeah, but I didn't have a clue. But Williams College, I actually made money going to Williams, so that was good, and had great professors there. The nephew of one of my teachers is right there. His
John
uncle
Hunt.
was, Clay Hunt was one of the legendary teachers at Williams, and a great friend of my great friend Don Gifford, who knew more about Joyce than Richard Ellman. So that was great. But then I had the triple whammy that the wider world didn't think qualified me for any job except I got one in a Circle K graveyard shift. Worked a couple days in a canning factory, because there were a lot of those in Oregon. Commercial fishing in Alaska. And I said, and I flirted with the idea. I got into the Stanford program for a PhD, and they were giving me money, but enough to live on. But they were up front and another place to let me, and had the same line, almost verbatim. However, we must tell you that at the end of, when you complete your doctorate in 3 years, and I said, you mean 6 years, we won't be able to help you find a job that you would want to have. So I said 30 and completely unemployable instead of 22 and pretty much unemployable. Bad odds. So desperation made me think for the first time that publishing would probably involve a business model that would hire people to do different things. Never had occurred to me or any of my literary friends at Williams. And it was a good time to be moving to New York, which I hated really, having visited there once, because that was, you know, this is 77, which the 60s had maybe ended a year or two before. So young people weren't moving to New York to work for some massive, great corporate publishing company that somehow are paranoid, thinking must have been profiteering from the war in Vietnam and all other bad things in capitalism. So I got lucky. I came into it at the right time, and I liked editing, which I'd done my whole college career. And I liked being around like-minded people for whom books of one sort or the other was the main reason to be alive. And I got some lucky breaks, but you just keep at it, and it's good to know what you think, which isn't as common as you would expect amongst editorial types. You know, some people think, well, God, the general public really likes this kind of shit, so I should like it too. But you gotta, to be of any use as an editor, you have to love every book you buy, and you have to buy it really for kind of pure reasons, because it's really good. And then you have to monetize it. You have to figure out what you can manage to sell, what other rights income you might be able to get. So it's a business, but it's a, you know, from the mathematical point of view, a moron like me can do it. I mean, it's not rocket science, but it's demanding because, you know, you never hear about bookstores being mobbed by people desperate to buy or steal, shoplift books.
You've
Doesn't
never been
happen.
to one of my readings, clearly.
No, no. That's an exception.
Yeah.
You know. But those are all fellow writers who were mobbing you.
Yeah, all one of them. The smallest crowd I ever had at a reading was one, which was my ex-wife.
Ouch. What did you tell the publicist after that?
We weren't speaking.
Yeah. That was the last straw.
Yeah. What's it, I mean, I know what it's like working for a big corporate, mega corporation, because I worked for Newsweek for a lot of years.
Yeah.
And I know you quite well, because among the other distinguished writers that Gary has edited, me. Yeah, you're very pure of heart in terms of your response to books and to literature. How the hell does that work in this Penguin, Random House, whatever huge corporate universe?
I mean, for those who don't have a great good fortune not to know anything about this, when I started at Little Random House, the publishing company, in 78, 2008 after 6 shitty months at a terrible publisher. And it was a small enough company then that I knew every person in the whole company, in every department, which I liked. And then the rest of the companies there was Pantheon, there was Ballantine, there was, a bunch of imprints, but suddenly, not only has Random House merged with Bantam, Doubleday, and Dell, been bought by a German conglomerate called Bertelsmann, which then merged with, in effect, we took over Viking Penguin. So it's far and away the biggest publisher in the world. I don't give a shit about that at all, because why would I? I mean, there's nothing interesting about it. I make sure to piss and moan as much as possible when they say, well, we have too many sales reps because now we have all this Penguin Random House, or Penguin, whatever they're called. Those reps, our own reps, and all the rest of it. And I said, well, books don't fucking sell themselves, and the only retail partners we have, and I heard from the start, and it's always in reference to Walden, Dalton, Barnes & Noble, and lately the kind of Nazis of Amazon. We don't want to do anything to offend our retail partners. And all along my response was, you must have a very weird, sadistic view of what partnership means, because this is like a woman calling a rapist her boyfriend. Independent booksellers, on the other hand, are our partners, and you don't stint on our writers and our booksellers who are crucial. That's why I'd never buy a book from Amazon unless there was no possible alternative. But in general, David, I don't pay it any mind. I mean, Knopf itself is too big for me to know everybody, and I'm bad with people's names and all that stuff. But it doesn't matter to me. I just do everything my way, and I pretty much always have. When I was a secretary, that was a little harder, but I just pretended I wasn't a secretary. And I was probably such an awful secretary that they said, Jesus, we have to promote this guy. Satisfied?
I'm pretty satisfied, yeah.
Yeah.
I was just trying to think of a question.
There's an aura of dissatisfaction. I just wanted to make sure.
No, it's an aura of scrambling to think,
What the hell else
yeah.
do I know anything about?
Yeah. Well, have things, well, maybe you don't know, but when you were mentioning B. Dalton, it kind of took me back to the distant past where there were bookstores. Has the rise of Amazon changed your life any?
Not happily, but it's.
See, I'm searching for the unhappiness here.
Well, it's a constant unhappiness, and it's strange because in the early years, the whole idea of online selling wasn't, was a new idea, and I thought it was kind of weird. I mean, by my taste, if I want to buy something, I actually want to look at it and hold it or see if it looks like it's any good. And that doesn't seem to stop 99.9% of my fellow Americans. But it was a very bookish startup. I had friends who...
Yeah, that's true. That's forgotten that it was essentially a bookstore.
It was books.
Before it was like a toaster
everything, the everything store. And I had friends who were very literary who got, this was a smart career move to get a job at Amazon in those early days, because they would get shares of stock that made them millionaires pretty quickly, which is not something that happens in for people in publishing. You know, I always say of publishing that it's a perfect match insofar as you have to work all the time and you're paid terribly. So but you don't have, you're working all the time, you don't have time to spend the money you're not making. So that's perfect. And it served me well my whole life. But back then, I mean, I was on the road with Redmond O'Hanlon, who's a terrific travel writer. He seems to have been taking a hiatus from writing lately, but I often like to go out with my writers when they're on tour because I get to see, it's wonderful to see see a writer confronted by his or her readership, and it's just wonderful to see, so heartening. And also I get to see my, my book-selling friends and make new friends in stores that I wouldn't have otherwise got to. And somebody calls, and this was pre-email and all this stuff, I don't know, maybe it was early 90s, maybe even mid-90s. Oh, and Redmond's book was the #2 book at Amazon. I said, well, I guess that's good. How many copies are we talking about? And I think it was the sales rep or sales manager who handled Amazon, and she said, they don't really like to divulge that information. And I said, well, I don't like paying somebody like you who doesn't answer my fucking question. So she finally coughed up a number which was, I think, 600. And I said, wow, is that in all time? I mean, cumulative? Yeah. And I said, I know 2 stores in Mississippi, Square Books in Oxford and Lemuria and Jackson. I said, those 2 stores have sold over 600 copies. So, I mean, tell Amazon, kiss my ass. Now they're far and away the biggest retail outlet for our books by a mile. And they've always lost money on books, but they used books that would drag people into their evil empire. And then when they'd sell more and more copies of books, you'd think they'd stop losing money. They lost more money. And in fact, 5 years ago, I think that on the whole, Amazon lost a stunning amount of money. But Wall Street understood what their game was and didn't pull out. Any other business with that kind of earnings history would have been shut down overnight, but not Amazon. Because if you can control all retail, eventually there's a time when they have you by the throat and will bleed you dry. Not my idea of a good time. There are some
You're
good
not
people.
Amazon.
Say what?
If you were Amazon, you'd be having a great time.
Oh, I guess. I'd buy the Washington Post.
Yeah.
I'd become
Oh, wait.
interested in space travel. That's a wacky deal.
I've often wondered this. This is maybe even an impolite question, but I published 4 books with you. Back when times were rosier, y'all used to send me out on the road, and I'd take airplanes to Portland or Minneapolis and stuff, and I'd be put up at nice corporate hotels, and I'd be fed, and 20 people would show up for my reading, and 3 of them would buy the book. Why were you taking such a bath on me?
Well, for the simple reason that, book marketing, in a nation that isn't just clamoring to become educated on the new books, and I've always said, when civilian friends say, what's the best thing that could happen for the book business. And I'd say, well, two things. If there were another dozen stores at the level of Powell's in Portland, Elliott Bay in Seattle, those two stores in Mississippi I mentioned, Books and Books in Miami. Not in New York. There's not been a really good bookstore there for the obvious reasons. A four-letter word, rent. Forget about it. But another, and people look at me like I'm insane. How could 12 stores make a difference? And I said, well, because the top 12 stores make a huge difference right now. If I could have double that number, obviously it would be doubly as good. Meanwhile, given that far too many books are published, I'd say if every publisher cut the size of their list in half, that would be better, because the oversupply of books creates a confusion. I mean, books have to compete. I have to publish my books first within Knopf to win those books the attention of my colleagues, who can't read every book that the company publishes, pardon me, but they should, but they don't. So that would make that a little bit simpler. And then, but of course, you tell that to an agent, and they always say, oh God, he would probably keep a lot of my books from getting sold to Knopf, which I would. But Knopf publishes a pretty good list. There's not really that many books on the list that I would personally say that was a mistake. And then there's the money thing. But anyway, I'm cycling away from David's question, which is a good one. But the background is there that the marketing of books is not really simple. Number one, we don't have endless reserves of money to spend on that. But no reading tour has ever paid for itself. There's no chance it could. But you're doing something for those communities, for those individual booksellers, which is life's blood. I mean, so you do it. You don't expect it's going to work by itself. Advertising, there's not an ad, I don't think, in the history, or in my time in publishing, that ever generated sales that would cover the expense of the ad. But it would generate some fraction of interest, as was in advertising and touring together. You're getting, what do they call it in this day and age, hits, like this website gets a trillion hits every day. I would say, monetize that for me, because I don't know what it means. But I think back in normal advertising days, Tim, if he was around, he could answer this question. You talk about, well, this book has got 6 hits. I mean, these 3 reviews and something on NPR, and you add it up. The more hits you get, you can't have too many. But you got to spend money in order to generate those things and to enlarge that number, because books don't sell themselves. They have to be sold within the company, to the bookseller, to horrible chain operations, and then there is a trickle-down effect. It's not the one the Republicans like to think of, but it trickles down to individual readers, and that's you all, and it's fun. If it was really easy, I don't think it would obviously be a happier business, but I like the challenge of it. Sometimes I like it so much I could beat myself to death with a tire iron, but because it's like nobody except really bad people, of course, would take any pleasure from murdering his or her children. And to be published is not to get absolutely murdered every time, but it can happen, and more often than not. A book, very rarely does a book exceed my expectations or even come close to them. But that the solution to that problem is not necessarily to, have your, former expectations ceiling and like high as that ceiling, and then bring them down to here so that you could trip over them. You got to. Enough is never enough. But it's just across the board. There's no one area of publishing that you can count on every time. Each book is different. I mean, it would be like, and I don't even know what the number of books published in this country is on an annual basis, but I don't know, 50,000, 100,000, then all the self-published stuff, that's a trillion. Not, if 10% of those books came close to, decently set expectation, I'd be surprised if it was that high. So it's, the disappointment quotient is real high, but there's all sorts of businesses in which to fail. But I like this one.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's the at work part of it, but what about the writer part of it? What exactly do you do? I mean, I know what you've done with manuscripts of mine.
Yeah.
How do you get a book?
Well,
And what do you do once you decide that you want it?
it's fun. I mean, it's, people say, God, you must read a lot. And I said, not as much as you think, because most books, most submissions come in. I can sometimes tell after a page or two that I'd rather cut my head off than read another page, much less publish the damn thing.
Yeah, I might add that Gary came out onto my porch this morning. We were smoking cigarettes, and he had his phone. He said, boy, I hate working over the phone. Just rejected 2 manuscripts this morning.
Yeah.
He'd been awake for probably 15 minutes.
Yep. Yeah, it took me longer than that, but it doesn't take long. So you sniff a lot, and then you live for the day when, in terms of new writers who I don't publish already, whose work I don't know. Sometimes there are people published elsewhere I do know their work, but when you find something that you want to keep turning the pages, while you're saying, God, I can't believe it. I mean, I wonder if I'm drunk or something. This is really good. That's what you live for. And in recent years, I mean, some people assume that I just publish great guys like David Yates because,
I
why
know
not?
stuff about you.
Yeah. But the writers I have published set the bar really high for me. And if you're not at that level, I mean, what am I, going to sort of sign a JV player to a, wonderful NFL team? It doesn't happen. But when it does, it's fabulous because, writers violate the basic law of nature that nothing comes of nothing. I mean, they create something out of nothing. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's a miracle. So then let's say, okay, this is good. So with new writers, I'm publishing a woman, Chris Kander, born and raised in Houston, where she still lives, which sometimes would make me suspicious of somebody with that background. But she'd self-published her first book, like in her garage, which is a terrific first novel that nobody, of course, heard of. She published her second novel with the esteemed but small New York press called The Other Press, which is run by a strange woman who's filthy rich, that's handy. It's really handy. And you can make a fortune in publishing if you come in with an unbelievably huge fortune. You could still have a little fortune. So I'd never heard of this writer before. I'd never heard of the agent, but she flattered me with some reference to an esteemed, now dead agent who liked me for some reason, and she was taught everything by this guy who was a gentleman, an old school kind of agent. And I fell in love with this book and did something unusual. I usually just go to my boss, Sonny Mehta, who's the best publisher in the English language I've ever seen, and I've known them all. And I just tell him about it, and he'll either say, "Oh, I get it, you know, what do you want to pay," and blah, blah, blah. Or, I'm sure, I want to read it, though. Let me read it, you know, and he reads more than anybody in the company. He read it and liked it, and then, for once, did a stupid thing. Well, I do stupid things all the time. I'll restate it. I did something, a stupid thing that I'd never done before, which is to get my colleagues to weigh in, you know. And I value my colleagues, but I don't need any help figuring out whether a book is good. I know it for myself. So that was a blunder because I could imagine selling this book in sort of 15, maybe 20 countries abroad, which drives, you know, the author gets income, we get income, it allows you to pay a bigger demand. But these people dawdled so long that people had heard about this book, and they were already started selling the rights, so I missed that opportunity. But anyway, in each case, you figure, you know, if it's a writer that, well, if it's a writer who's been published by anybody, I mean, if it's a Knopf writer, I know what the sales figures are, I can do the math. If it was published by somebody else, you can get the sales figures. I mean, and that was true before computers came along. With a few phone calls, you could know pretty much exactly what a book had sold and what a new book by that author might be worth. So, you know, I can do the P&Ls, and you just do that and then negotiate with the agent, which is sometimes it's a case where my colleagues at other companies apparently voluntarily offer an advance that has no chance of ever being earned out. If the book was struck by lightning over and over and over again, you're still going to lose $500,000. I mean, the number of advances that are earned back, I think probably across the board in publishing, earned back maybe 15%. So then it's just a question of how much you're losing on the 85 that might only lose $5,000 or $10,000 in the advance, or $2 million, take your pick. And you say, well, gosh, with that kind of crappy performance, how can any publisher not go out of business? It's something called backlist. Books that live on and on and on and on, and that is what enables them to do it. You know, but you know, if you have a backlist, you know, your publisher is profitable. Say, if you know, I think the Knopf backlist peaked at maybe something like $100 million a year, which is not chump change. We would be profitable if we didn't lose all that money. You know, the leftover is our profit. I ran a smaller company that a friend of mine bought with the understanding that I would come over and run it for him. And we didn't, it was the company is older, or maybe even older than Knopf. But it was a lot of nonfiction in that backlist that didn't, you know, sell enough to keep reprinting. So we didn't have that luxury of a huge backlist, so we had to be really smart and really stingy, which is a good combination in all walks of life. Don't burn money up. I mean, it's not what it's there for. So then you go through that, and the negotiating contracts part is not my favorite at all. But my favorite thing is editing the book. And that's the most time-intensive part of the whole job, because my pace has always been 5 pages an hour. And if, no, regardless of whether it's Cormac McCarthy or Peter Guy, who was a new writer to my list a couple of years ago with a great book called Wintering, which I highly recommend. Same deal. I mean, and he's an accomplished writer. First-time writers often have never been edited because it takes so goddamn long. I mean, 5 pages an hour, you do the math and you say, gosh, number one, this 500-page book does not really want to be 500 pages. It probably wants to go on a slimming diet and get down to like 350, but not just by tearing out a big chunk and calling it good. It's word by word all the way through, and you have to read it more carefully than anybody who isn't insane or married to the writer would ever think about doing, even at gunpoint. But I love it because you get into the DNA of the book. You love the book already. If you happen to die overnight, you know, it's perfectly good enough to get published as it is, but I've never known a book that didn't need editing. Never, ever. And, you know, people, great writers who are also fastidious, and great prose stylists and great intellects and whatnot, Julian Barnes or Martin Amis, I mean, there's a whole bunch of them, 5 pages an hour. And then I just give those pages to the writer and I say, you know, it's akin to having, instead of a conversation, it's somebody boring you to death for hours, babbling away. And then you get your turn to go through, look at those pages and say, oh, hell with this. I mean, no. I said, I don't care what you do, just consider them, because you'll see, you might say, no, there's nothing wrong with that sentence, or there's nothing wrong with that character. But everybody, my job is to really give each writer I publish a better set of eyeglasses. They can see their book more clearly because you're so close to something you've worked on for years and done countless drafts. And I've noticed throughout my career, once you get from the original typescript and you see the first pass of galleys, it's the first time you haven't seen that those pages that you've written, rewritten, always, suddenly, just the fact that it's in a different typeface. And the pages aren't like the old pages, they're different. And you'll look at some sentence, and the writer will say, I thought that was maybe the best sentence in this book, and it sucks. Well, that's what that's not what I go through writing. This sucks. David had a good remark about an old Newsweek editor. Say better, please?
Say better, please. Gary's equivalent of say better, please is to write duh in the margin. Something that's just something so obvious.
But it's great. It's great. I mean, back in the old days, you had to work in pencil and you had to really print every letter of every word because it had to be completely legible. You had to tell some writers just have horrible handwriting. I don't know how they manage, but I just say, don't make a mess of this. I mean, we have to send this to the printer to make these corrections. And that made everything that much more difficult. So some computers are of some use, obviously. And so now I work in green, not green pencil, but green ink, and I don't need to be terribly fastidious in writing this stuff down. Send it to the writer and tell him or her, do whatever you want. If you can't read my handwriting, I'll translate it. But I don't care what you do. It's your book.
Yeah.
I'm not a collaborator of yours.
Yeah, I'll tell a story that seems to me the essence of what you do for people. In my second novel, first version of it was pretty much a disaster. It got better, but there were 2 chapters in it. And one chapter had a mother and daughter taking a 4-hour drive up to the country. Another chapter had them taking a 4-hour drive back from the country. And I did a fabulous job with those chapters, I have to insist. Their voices were spot on. You know, I had everything about it right.
Passing scenery was beautifully
Scenery is
rendered.
beautiful. And Gary said, you know, I'd cut those 2 chapters. You know, it's your book. You can cut, you know, I would cut those 2 chapters. If you want to keep them, just explain to me why I need them.
Yeah.
And I suddenly realized, no, I don't. I don't need to, yeah, I don't need 30 pages to
Travelogue.
when I can put them there. Yeah, it was revelatory to me in many, many ways, and also revelatory of your discretion and respect. I don't know what you would have done to punish
I mean, it's not often that I make big sweeping deals like that, but
Yeah.
I'll do it if I have to.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it is always the writer's book. I mean, the only bad reaction I ever gotten to from a writer was, I was nervous when I was like, I don't know, 26 years old and editing Gore Vidal, and he at some point said, Jesus Christ, at last some editor is doing his goddamn job. Everybody's so terrified of pissing me off that they don't do anything. I mean, the best editor has to be your best reader. Gore never, you know, was anything less than happy with what I did. And a few other people who, you know, I mean, a good editor isn't going to piss anybody off. Bad editors should be shot. They violate all my little rules. Not if they work for me, they don't. You know, they're going to go fuck up some other company. But I bought this one book at auction by a writer who'd published 2 books that were really acclaimed and all the rest of it. And she had a little bit of a reputation of being not the easiest person to work with, but, and I was reading this book and I said, you must have been drunk when you bought this. I mean, there's not a sentence in it that isn't incomplete, ungrammatical, ugly. One reason or the other, not a single sentence. I said, she's not going to like the look of these pages, because they were just solid green ink. And I said, oh boy, this could be a problem. She calls up one day and said, oh, you know, thanks for that. All your changes are fine. I said, well, thanks, Amy. Called up the agent. I said, I'm never doing another book with this woman because I'm not a co-writer. I'm not a hired hand who gets to finish some job that she doesn't give a shit about. I mean, never again. But so that's one person out of a few thousand. I don't have any idea how many books I published, but
Gary, I think that was your kicker, because Deborah is hovering. She wants to go on to the next.
Yep, we're fired.
We're fired. We're fired.
Thanks for coming.